the next section for the next 20 minutes or so is going to be a little bit about questions that people have. I'm also going to just have a very quick show of everybody of our website as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen for the moment while we take a few questions, and then I'll just show you some of the things that hopefully people will find helpful from the FTD Talk website. So let's just go through the questions that we have at the moment. So the first question is about how people inherit genetic FTD. So I suppose it's useful just to say that FTD is genetic only in about a third of people, so somewhere around 30%. So for 70% of people, we do not know still, despite lots of research, why people do develop FTD, and there is lots of work still going on, but for those people, we don't understand that. But for the 30% of people that do have a genetic form, it's a form of inheritance which is called autosomal dominant. So autosomal dominant means that it goes from one generation down to the next. We all have two versions of every gene. And so in an autosomal dominant disease, you only need one of those to go wrong. So that means when you have children, 50% of the time, someone with FTD will pass their normal gene down, and that means those children will not develop FTD. But in 50% of cases, they will pass the abnormal gene, the genetic mutation, down, and therefore children of people who have a genetic form of FTD will have a 50% risk of carrying the genetic mutation. One thing that we always discuss with people is that it is very likely that if you carry the genetic mutation, that you will develop symptoms during life, but there are a small number of people, probably around 5% of people, with the progranulin and the C9orf72 genes who do seem to develop symptoms only very late in life, in their 80s or 90s. And so some people will die of other reasons before they develop FTD if they get into their 80s and 90s. And that's something that we're only just starting to understand a little bit more. One of the other questions is about FTD and problems with walking. As will be mentioned throughout the day, the main variants of FTD are the behavioral variants and the language variants, known as primary progressive aphasia. But we know that both of those conditions overlap with a group of disorders that affect movement. The first of those is motor neuron disease, and that can certainly affect walking. And the other are the conditions that are called atypical or non-typical Parkinsonian diseases, or Parkinsonism. And those include some particular names of diseases: corticobasal syndrome or corticobasal degeneration, and another condition called progressive supranuclear palsy. And again, both of those conditions can affect walking, but also affect how people move their hands and use their hands as well. So, looking through the questions that people have sent through, the next question is, since several genes cause both FTD and ALS, or motor neuron disease, is there a common effort to share therapeutical approaches? And the answer to that is yes. So Lucy spoke about the C9orf72 gene, and that's a good example because that's the most common cause genetically across the world of both FTD and ALS. Both companies that are working on the gene silencing therapy, or the ASO therapy, those are both thinking about how you work together between FTD and ALS. And it's commonly a different group of researchers, but we've been brought together to try and solve the problem of C9orf72. And certainly it's likely that many of the trials that happen in this condition will happen in both people with FTD and ALS. And of course, there are a group of people that will develop symptoms of both, as well as people who develop symptoms only of one or the other in C9orf72. So I think it's a great question, because there've been many years where those two groups have not worked together very well, but certainly are being brought together to share approaches to how you do things. And certainly that's the way that lots of the companies that are involved in developing therapies are thinking, is about how you bring together researchers from those fields. And in fact, I was only at a meeting recently about that. And then I think the other question that we have here is, how advanced is brain imaging of animal models of FTD? Do we think this will be useful for understanding the mechanisms of pathology and progression to cure? It's a good question. So that's well outside my area of expertise, but we do work with people occasionally that do brain imaging, particularly MR imaging, magnetic resonance imaging of animals and animal models. The issue of animal models has always been trying to get something that really represents, and we're talking usually in mice, whether it really represents what is going on in humans. We did work on one particular study, which Martina worked on, with a group who used magnetic resonance imaging to think about people that have tau pathology. And some similar findings were found in animals as in humans. And so I think there are some useful things to be done. But at the end of the day, this is a very human disease. And I think particularly as Yolanda was talking about, the key to this is around social cognition. And when we go to think about what's happening in the brain at the level of pathology, we know that some of the key brain cells that are affected are brain cells called von Economo neurons, or von Economo brain cells named after a particular pathologist. And those brain cells seem to be those that control social cognition, and they are only found in certain creatures that exhibit social cognitive skills. So I think there will always be some limitations of animal models, as much as it can be helpful for some of the initial basic science research. At the end of the day, we will have to work out what is going on in humans, hence the importance of a lot of the cross international collaborative research around. So I think we have a few minutes left. I can see one other question that's come in, which is, what is the prognosis of FTD? That is very different between different forms of FTD. So, and definitely different between different genetic forms as well. So there are some disorders, like the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia, where actually people commonly live from symptom onset for around 15, often up to 20 years. So probably one of the longer living illnesses. And in some other diseases, it is much shorter. So there's lots of work looking at the overlap of frontotemporal dementia and ALS, or motor neuron disease. And often those are the more shorter lived illnesses, so 5 years or less from symptom onset. So what I normally say to people when I see them in the clinic, it is that it's a very individual issue. And even within when we give an average value, that is an average value, and nobody is, everyone is an individual, and very few people are average. So what we often say to people is that if your disease has been progressing slowly so far, it'll often carry on progressing slowly. If it's been going fast so far, then it'll carry on progressing rapidly. So there's lots of work to try and help predict that. And I know that when I sit in my clinic in London and talk to people and have given them a diagnosis, one of the first questions that people ask is, well, what is the timeline of this? And we'd really like to be able to give an answer to that. And we do hope that some of the research ongoing will help with that. One of the markers that Aitana talked about, neurofilament light chain, which can be measured now both in spinal fluid and in blood, has promise for telling us a little bit about the speed of disease and how fast things are moving. So we really hope that we might be able to develop some markers which will be able to tell us much more about what is the prognosis for people. So if there are no more questions, I'm just going to show people a little bit about our website. So this is www.ftdtalk, and it tells you a little bit about our research and our research team, and you can see all the people who have been talking to you today. But I hope what we've done is we've spent a lot of time talking to people with FTD about the kind of information they would want and what they would have wanted when they first were told the diagnosis. So here is just little bits of information about the history and about the different clinical syndromes. And if you click on different things, here's a little bit about management. It tells you about what drugs are currently people use and for FTD, but also a little bit about supportive management. And we link to some papers. So in particular, we link to a really useful paper about the use of speech and language therapy in PPA, which is produced by our team as well. It also links to rare dementia support and to other support websites. In particular, I think people have found our fact sheets helpful. These are downloadable, so they're relatively simple. They're things that you can always give to your primary care physician who may not know so much about FTD. So relatively simply produced and downloadable as a PDF, but available in various forms. We're hoping to be able to produce these in different languages over time, and we have lots of very nice people who are helping us think about how we would produce that. There's a link to all of the sports, so a nice link to World FTD United, but a link to different support groups around the world. If anyone feels that they're missing, then we can include that. I think one of the things that we would like to have more is about discussing the diagnosis with people's children. There's a nice series of resources from the AFTD in the US around that, with a specific website for children, which I think is helpful. And I think for people with families with FTD and genetic FTD, we get lots of questions, and the kind of questions that come up at these kinds of meetings about, should I undergo genetic testing? I have genetic FTD. How and when shall I tell my family? And what is my risk of developing FTD? What's pre-symptomatic testing? When will I develop symptoms? What are my options for having children? We spent a lot of time over many years receiving those kind of questions. And so there's lots of information there about that. So do please contact us if you have any questions about things. We, as Nikki said, run 3 support groups in the UK. At the moment, those are all virtual. So we run a specific sort of all-round FTD support group, but we also run a PPA support group, and we have the help of one of our speech therapists who helps with that. And then lastly, we run a group very specifically for people with familial FTD, and that's really for people living at risk of FTD. And one of our members of our team, Caroline Greaves, is currently developing some work to think about how to support people who are living at risk of genetic FTD. So people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, we recognize that while some people will have gone to genetic testing or genetic counseling, quite a number of people will never have really received any psychological support about what it means to live at risk of FTD and potentially develop the disease later in life. So our support group is there to help with that, but we're also in the process of developing some support and psychological support interventions, as I know also are our collaborators in Rotterdam at the Erasmus Medical Centre are doing some similar things as well. So very lastly, just before I hand over, I just want to plug one other important bit of research which we're doing, which is which is a app called Ignite. We're always thinking about how we can detect FTD as early as possible. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment is a cognitive testing app, which is available on the App Store. It's only available at the moment, but if you go to the App Store or have a look on our website, igniteftd.com, you'll see this. We're looking to have 1,000 people in the general population test it. We're up to 700 at the moment. And so if your English is your first language and you haven't done it, then we'd be very grateful. Eventually, we'll end up testing it in people with FTD, but at the moment, it's just being tested in people within the control population.